Okay, we got this. We got this. Just fixing my camera. Okay, hello, we're back. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about chronic fatigue. Now, chronic fatigue is something that's becoming more and more commonplace. I'll get into some of the numbers in a second, but for those of you who don't know, streaming this on Instagram right now and on YouTube, and this is going to end up staying on YouTube after it's done. So that's kind of going to be where it's posted. I'll post a link to it on Instagram, but that's where it's going to be. So let's just get into it. Chronic fatigue. So, did you know, first of all, that there's chronic fatigue syndrome? Now, when you hear the word syndrome, usually that means that, well, people just kind of don't know what's going on. So it gets slapped with the word syndrome, kind of put at the end of it, just as like, this is the name for it. This is what we call it. It's becoming more common. It does go by a few different names. So it could be chronic fatigue and immune deficiency dysfunction syndrome, or CFIDS. Could be myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME. It could also be systemic exertion intolerance disease. So there are a few different names we have for chronic fatigue syndrome. According to the CDC, people with chronic fatigue syndrome have overwhelming fatigue and a host of other symptoms that are not improved by bed rest, and that can get worse after physical activity or mental exertion. So that's kind of what the CDC calls it. As of right now, there's at least over 1 million Americans that have CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. It's actually more common than things like multiple sclerosis, like lupus, and like many forms of cancer. Seems to be more common in women than men, and typically happens in like the 40s and 50s. That seems to be the ballpark in terms of age range where it's most common. So to technically be diagnosed, you need to have 4 of 8 symptoms. So I have a list here I'll go through. Post-exertion malaise lasting more than 24 hours. So that's post usually having exercised. Unrefreshing sleep, significant impairment of short-term memory or concentration, muscle pain, pain in the joints without swelling or tenderness, headaches of a new type, pattern, or severity, tender lymph nodes in the neck and armpit, and a sore throat that is frequently recurring. So again, 4 out of 8 of those. Tricky thing with chronic fatigue is that there is no lab test for it. There is no marker that you can look at and go, hey, you have chronic fatigue. It's just kind of something that comes up in a history, in a story with a patient that you're going to eventually kind of find out more about. Tricky thing is things like fatigue and other symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome tend to kind of fall in line with a lot of different potential quote unquote diagnoses. So again, sometimes it could be missed or sometimes it's overlooked because fatigue is general. It's a pretty general symptom. So it's pretty tough to kind of pick up from if you're talking about a diagnosis standpoint. So because there is no single test to confirm it, for example, if we've looked at, say, type 2 diabetes, we have hemoglobin A1C and we have blood glucose and we have some other markers that we can use to kind of help support that. That's a little bit more straightforward in terms of like how you can find it. But when it comes to chronic fatigue, there isn't like one marker that you can look to and be like, hey, that's fatigue. Another big issue is, of course, because there is no specific biochemical pathway that we know is specifically associated. There are no pharmaceutical prescription drugs that are specifically developed for CFS, and symptoms can vary a lot person to person here. So, there is no like real single reason as to why people might suffer from chronic fatigue. The reality is it's a variety of different causes, usually multiple of them, that can eventually lead to something like different types of infections or immune irregularities or stress or trauma or toxins. We're going to dive into all those. So it could be every one of these. It could be, like I said, post-viral infection. It could be just a lot of stress from any of the 3 main stress causes. Is it physical, structural? Is it chemical? Is it emotional? Are any of those out of balance? That could be leading to fatigue. It could be infections, like I mentioned as well. So, a lot of different things kind of going on here. What we do know is that the central nervous system is going to be playing a role. Now, that is going to be your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is also known as your HPA axis, which is responsible for releasing things like corticotropin releasing hormone, cortisol, other hormones like adrenaline that we'll get into. These can also are going to influence your energy levels and your ability to maintain and recover energy. So really important. It comes down to a lot of this is going to come down to autonomic nervous system regulation. So something to keep in mind, as we're going forward. And, there's a stress. So if we were to define stress, right? So like what is stress? A stress is any real or imagined threat and your body's response to it. So not only is it the actual threat itself or the idea of a threat, it is how your bodies respond. So this is where you might hear the fight or flight response. This is a sympathetic response to said imagined threat. But how does the stress response really kind of work? So we talked a little bit about this before in a different video, but we'll try to break it down a little bit more here as it pertains to stress in particular. So there are a few different parts here. There's going to be the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the adrenal glands, the autonomic nervous system, the HPA axis. These are all going to play a role. So we're going to break kind of each of these down, a little bit. And we'll try to go like kind of in order from the top down, so to speak. So the first thing that's always important is the amygdala. So with the amygdala, again, this is the emotional processing part of the brain. It also is useful for interpreting images and sounds. So it's processing those sounds coming in. It's processing those images that come in through the eyes. Again, the eyes are directly connected to the brain through the optic nerve. So all that information kind of goes through and is processed in the amygdala. And then from there, we come up with a way how we perceive it and then how we react to something. So the amygdala, in many ways, is responsible for perceiving danger. And if there is danger, it sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus, again, we talked about in another video, it's the command center. So the hypothalamus is responsible for things like controlling your breathing, controlling blood pressure, heartbeat, blood vessel contraction or dilation. It also is kind of the part of the brain that talks with the autonomic nervous system. In other words, this is your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The hypothalamus is part of regulating that system. Now, we talked a little bit about the sympathetic. So the sympathetic is, again, our fight or flight response. So where the parasympathetic tends to be more of a rest and digest. This is where healing happens. So like if you're a slow healer or if you tend to not heal quickly, chances are you're kind of stuck in this sympathetic state. And if we can't sort of wind down, if we can't find a way to regulate that stress and go into parasympathetic, that's going to affect our ability to heal as quickly as we would like. So that's something kind of important to kind of keep in the back of your mind is our ability to downshift is going to literally affect our ability to heal. So that's pretty important. So, but as it pertains to the stress response, when we perceive that stress through the hypothalamus and then the amygdala, then what happens is through the amygdala, we can turn on or activate the sympathetic response. And then from there, the sympathetic nervous system can send signals to the adrenal glands. And in the adrenal glands then will be triggered to start producing and releasing a hormone known as adrenaline or epinephrine. And epinephrine can do things like increase heart rate, increase blood flow, particularly to the muscles, heart, and vital organs. So what happens is in a state of stress, of sympathetic dominance, we'll call it, blood flow is essentially going to be shunted away from the sex organs, away from digestion, and going to go to vital organs for survival. Because again, our bodies are incredibly smart in the way they're designed. Those are obviously really important, but again, we are going to prioritize immediate survival over long-term future. So when all that, so the blood and essentially the processing ability of the digestive organs, of the sex organs, is going to be kind of put on the back burner for this interpretation of an immediate need to survive. So the blood goes again to the muscles, to the heart, and other organs needed literally to flee or fight. It's also going to increase pulse rate and blood pressure. And again, makes sense. It's going to increase your breathing rate and dilate the bronchioles in the lungs so you can get more oxygen in. There's going to be even more oxygen sent to the brain to keep you kind of on your toes. Other senses become really sharp, like your hearing, like your sight. These are more needed in a time of fight or flight, or you need some sort of immediate kind of feedback. Again, those are going to be your organs that are your senses that are most important. Also going to trigger the release of blood sugar from fat, so that can then be used as glucose, because again, we need glucose for muscles to do their thing and function properly as a source of energy. So these are all things that epinephrine, adrenaline can do. What also happens, so that's kind of what we're getting in terms of, that's essentially all kind of the first stage of what's happening. We're getting adrenaline, we're getting epinephrine released, and that's kind of how that whole process works. Now, there's a second part of it where we have this HPA axis that we talked about. And again, this is going to rely on the activation of the sympathetic nervous system too. So the hypothalamus, again, is going to release something known as corticotropin releasing hormone. This is CRH, which triggers the pituitary to then release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is ACTH. And that is then going to go to the adrenal glands, and this is going to release cortisol. So and again, cortisol is going to be active in that sympathetic response. Now, when that threat is over, when we escape, when we win in a fight, those cortisol levels should come back down. The parasympathetic nervous system can sort of come back online as the sympathetic nervous system begins to kind of mellow out a bit. Problem is, we tend to live in a world where there are a lot of stresses. And again, what is stress? It is something that is actually happening or we believe to perceive is happening. And again, there's only 3 different types of stresses. We have physical, chemical, and emotional. Are we in stress, when we're stuck in a traffic jam late for work, or when we're rushing to eat lunch or breakfast because we're late on our way to work, or it's because we have a job we hate? These are all things that are going to keep that sympathetic nervous system active. That's going to keep that sympathetic nervous system continuing to go, even though it doesn't seem like there's an immediate threat. Because remember, that stress response is triggered whether that threat is actually happening or it's something we simply perceive. Or it's also could be something that is going to be, that's going to be the severity of it. Even if it's something that we perceive is more severe than we actually is, then we're still going to get that response. So important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, what happens is, if we're under the stress response for a long time, if it's constantly active, we're going to get a lot of cortisol. We're going to get extra cortisol released, and it's going to continue to get released. And this is going to do things like increase blood sugar levels. It's going to decrease protein synthesis, because again, we need to be in sort of a relaxed state for this to happen. When this happens, when we're in that constantly stressed state, it can lead to muscle wasting. It can lead to the demineralization of bone, and this could lead to things like osteoporosis. It can cause dysfunction of lymphatic tissue. It could actually decrease different white blood cell numbers like lymphocytes. And it could also, like I mentioned before, interfere with the healing process. If we're not actually in that downshifted state, in that parasympathetic state, it can literally affect our ability to heal. So when we have that, this is kind of where adrenal fatigue comes into the picture, right? So when we're under this cortisol dominant, sympathetic dominant state for a really long time, the adrenals can eventually get overworked and essentially almost burn out. So when we get into this state of kind of fatigue, there are a variety of different um, symptoms that you can come up with, whether it's difficulty gaining weight or building muscle, becoming more irritable, confusion or cognitive impairment, autoimmune hepatitis, palpitations, lower blood pressure, PMS, headaches, unexplained hair loss. That's a big one. Indigestion, autoimmune diseases, insomnia, low body temperature, nervousness, depression, hypoglycemia, memory loss, osteoporosis, weakened immune system, inflammatory conditions, or maybe something like autoimmune type conditions, dizziness, vertigo, dry and thin skin, chronic fatigue. You see how this is all starting to come together. So it also can affect the thyroid. So again, we talked about some of those things like chronic fatigue, like depression, but also things like fibromyalgia or IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, or higher cholesterol or irregular menstrual cycles. Or it could be, again, check your hair and nails. Are they of low quality? Are they, thinning? Hair loss again. Are you getting cold hands and feet? Low libido, infertility, gum disease? Are you having issues with fluid retention? All of these are kind of worth checking into. So yes, it's going to affect the adrenals. Yes, it's going to affect the thyroid long term. And you wonder kind of why we see a lot of adrenal issues, thyroid issues. It could be just because of this kind of chronic fatigue. And these are the organs that get affected the most. So kind of important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, there's other things that chronic stress can do. So like I said, in a state of stress, when that sympathetic nervous system is firing, that blood flow is getting shunted from digestive organs to the muscles, to the heart, to the lungs. So that's going to mean metabolism is going to be slowed, which again is going to affect a lot of things when it comes to weight. It's going to decrease enzyme production in the gut. So this could lead to potential digestive issues, which leads to poor nutrient absorption or poor oxygenation in all of those organs, like the stomach, like the spleen, like the liver and intestines, and pancreas. So all of these kidneys are going to get affected. And again, when you're in that high stress environment, this could raise things like triglycerides and cholesterol too. So in many ways, anything can kind of lead to anything here. And you're seeing how stress is kind of at the root of this. Remember, like 80 to 90% of all doctor's visits are in some way due to stress of some kind. And you can see how through this HPA axis, how through the hypothalamus and the amygdala and the brain and the autonomic nervous system, how you're already affecting all of these different organs in different ways. So, according to the American Psychological Survey, there are 25% of Americans are experiencing high level of stress, and 50% of Americans are experiencing moderate levels of stress. So do you not think that this might cause a little bit of an issue on the adrenal glands, on the thyroid, on the digestive tract, and you wonder why we have higher rates of things like dysbiosis, like food sensitivities, like low libido, like poor thyroid function? You see how it all starts to make sense. And remember, there's only 3 types of stress. You have emotional stress, physical stress, chemical stress. And when you see this, again, when you're overloaded with emotional, physical, chemical stresses, we see what it could do with adrenal fatigue. We see what it could do with thyroid, but also it can lead to, again, hormone imbalances down the road, which are issues when you're talking about irregular cycles and poor energy and living out of norm with circadian rhythm. So now you're talking about sleep and lethargy. And now you can see how chronic fatigue kind of comes back into this picture. Also, because digestion's affected, you're going to get less nutrients absorbed through the digestive tract, because again, that blood is not going to the digestive tract if we're not consuming food in a relaxed state. A sedentary lifestyle is a whole nother thing because there are things known as good stress. So being under stress in a positive environment can help regulate that autonomic nervous system between the sympathetic and parasympathetic as well. This is why exercise is particularly crucial for helping maintain regularity between that sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system. This isn't news, but we definitely live in a toxic environment. I talk a lot about last week we talked about liver health and the multitude of different chemicals and parabens and phthalates and glyphosate and pesticides and herbicides and potential medications and antibiotics that the liver has to go through and detoxify. So if we're not getting the nutrients that we can from our diet, or we're not processing them properly because we're actually getting blood shunted away from digestion and eating in a stressed state, that's literally going to affect our digestion directly. So even if we are consuming some more nutrient dense foods, are we actually absorbing and breaking it down properly so we can use it to detoxify through our toxic environment and toxic foods and GMO soy and corn and glyphosate and everything in between and potentially antibiotics. So like you are starting to see how this picture all kind of comes together. So when it comes to this stuff, I have a friend who talks about excesses and deficiencies. So generally, the first step is to try to avoid and fill in the gaps. So, if there are any things like unnecessary antibiotics or medications, we need to start to try to get those out if we can, because again, those are other toxins that are going to eventually affect something down the road. The liver still has to cycle through that. And if we're not getting the nutrients we need to do that, that's going to cause downstream issues. Environmental toxins, listen, there's no way that we're going to avoid all of these in this day and age. What we can do is control the controllables. We can get cleaner shampoos and soaps. We can ditch the toxic cleaners and go with something that's a little better. I personally like Branch Basics right now, but there are really easy home cleaners that you can make at home. Skincare products are really big too. I'm a big fan of the Environmental Working Group's Healthy Living app. There's also another one called Skin Deep that's really useful that you could download on your phone. You could check a lot of these products. They rate them on a 1 to 10 scale. So you can see kind of which toxic ingredients are in them. Many of these are endocrine disruptors. And endocrine, again, means they're messing with our hormone issues or our hormone production. So with that, again, if there's issues with that, it's going to have downstream effects. That's essentially what hormones do. They're not involved in one thing. They have downstream effects. GMO foods, non-organic foods, can we avoid these as best we can? Can we support local farmers that are being a little bit more regenerative? Can we do things that are, again, supporting more organic sort of farms where we're using less pesticides, where we're trying to live literally a little bit more in line with the earth and not using pesticides that are going to wreck the microbiome and then lead to a lot of these issues? Are there any nutrient deficiencies that need to be addressed? Magnesium's a big one. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But other real big ones that come up are things like B12 and zinc and vitamin D, which is as easy as going outside, which is what I'm going to do as soon as I get off of this. So, there's all of those things that are going to be really useful. And then it's really going to be about plugging in the gaps. So with that, sometimes like I was saying before, the nervous system is obviously a really important part here. So, being a chiropractor, obviously I have a little bit more knowledge kind of into this. So when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system and that functioning properly, finding that balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic, what that can do, if we're not in alignment, if we're not in a way where we are optimizing our nervous system function, you can imagine that we're going to be leaning more in that sympathetic state. So when you're in that sort of slumped position and your neck's forward, that's literally putting stress on the back of your body, even as I'm sitting down. That to me, that positioning is sending different signals to my brain saying, oh man, this is a stress state. This is also sort of triggering that stressful state, that sympathetic response a little bit. So again, it does happen in levels, but it's really important to kind of understand that. Again, exercise is really important, and I know people love talking about it for weight loss, but that's like the least of not the least, but one of the more important. Like, there's so many other important benefits you can get from regular exercise, like better sleep, like resistance to infections, especially going around now with all this craziness going on, with improving brain function, improving your emotional health, lowering your risk of cancer and heart disease, which, believe it or not, despite what the media might want you to think, are still the number 1 and 2 killers here in the United States. So breathing is another big thing. This is another thing that I've been talking a little bit about more, but how you breathe, that body position is going to affect how the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are turned on and off. So our ability to breathe properly, our ability to breathe smoothly and slowly and nasally are going to trigger the activation of that sympathetic nervous system to get digestion going. This is why when I sit down with clients and patients, one of the first things I do, especially if they have reflux or digestive issues, one of the questions that you ask is, are you literally just sitting and being with your food? Are you taking a few just long breaths? Are you enjoying the moment even a little bit? Are you just using all 5 of your senses to eat? Like, one of the reasons I love food is the one form of art where you're actually utilizing all 5 of your senses, right? Taste, smell, hear, touch, and you can obviously see it. So all of these are really important. And another part, particularly when it comes to breathing, again, breathing is largely going to be controlled by the diaphragm. So, and our diaphragm is more active when we are nasally breathing. And remember, we move lymph, we move toxins in our body through the lymphatic system. But how does the lymphatic system move? It's actually through muscle contraction largely. So, and the diaphragm is one muscle that is always going to be moving. So, really, really important. Now, nutrition is obviously really important, particularly when it comes to neurotransmitters. So things like serotonin are really important. About 90% of serotonin is going to be created in the gut. So having an optimal gut function, really, really important. So if there are gut issues, it's really important to check those out. Are there imbalances when it comes to yeast or fungi or viruses or parasites? Like, those are things you have to address and target, and then you can rebuild with things like Saccharomyces boulardii and stuff like that. You know, going a more plant-based approach, you don't necessarily need to go 100% vegan, but getting a lot more fruits and vegetables in, getting those antioxidants in, that fiber, really important. You can also support the replenishment of the gut with fermented foods like sauerkraut, like kimchi, like miso, like natto. So, like, you can go a really long way in really helping with that. Vitamin D, also really important. Why? Because it can help produce serotonin in the brain. It also can help increase nerve growth. So really, really important. So it's as simple. And again, this time of year, just getting outside. Like, do we need to supplement with vitamin D? Not necessarily, especially this time of year. Now, vitamin D deficiencies are linked to things, again, sounds similar to what we're talking about: digestive disorders, osteoporosis, other skeletal disorders, depression and mental disorders, chronic infections, cardiovascular disease, all different types of cancers, autoimmune diseases, autism. So, and we've seen then there's plenty of reasons and environmental factors for that, but we can't talk about all that now. But this is part of the puzzle. So important to kind of get that out. And again, getting outside every day is key. I talk about the sun all the time. The sun is not there trying to kill you. It is simply, we have adopted lifestyles where a large majority of us are not simply adapted to it. That starts with what we take in to our body, particularly a lot of different antioxidants. Going back to that diet part that I was talking about, a lot of different antioxidants, a lot of different colored fruits and vegetables. If you really want to test this out on yourself. You can take something like astaxanthin for 2 to 3 weeks and then go out in the sun, and chances are you will get very little or much less susceptible, less prone to sunburns. Why? Because we have the antioxidant stores that we need. Easier way to do this is to simply be out in the sun more often. You can build up a skin callus. That's a separate talk for another day, but it's also really important. K2 is really important too. So thing like for fermented foods, sometimes grass-fed organic animal products can have it too, but really important for the utilization of vitamin D. Now you can actually create vitamin K2 from K1, but you have to have good gut health. So do you necessarily need to get it from animal products? No, but you have to make sure your digestion is on point. Omega 3s are also really important when we're talking about brain health and fatigue. So, I know fish oil is a big thing, but getting that optimal balance between omega 3s and 6s is huge. I prefer to obviously get them from plant-based sources if possible. So things like flax seeds and walnuts and chia seeds, and also things like seaweeds, really important, easy that you can add in on a regular basis. Now, magnesium is another big one. So somewhere between 60 and 80 some odd percent of Americans are magnesium deficient. This is a problem because magnesium can play a role in over 300 different enzymes in the body, different enzymatic reactions in the body. Really important as for antioxidant production, and protection, but also really important in liver health. It also must be balanced with vitamin D, K2, and calcium to use it properly. So you can actually overdo vitamin D, particularly in supplement form. It's usually not going to happen from natural exposure, but with supplement form can actually inhibit your ability to use magnesium. So something to kind of keep in mind. And again, use the medicine we have that's given right to us outside. So magnesium is really important for energy, creating energy. So ATP, you need magnesium to generate ATP and utilize it properly. It's really important for helping digest proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And remember, we need those nutrients. If our digestion isn't on point, we're not absorbing the nutrients we even might be consuming. So really important for that. What else do we have here? So we talked a little bit about sleep. The other part here is emotional stress that I really want to cover today. So there's plenty of different ways and techniques you can use. So things like prayer or meditation of any kind, that's a great place to start. You could look into things like NLP, neuro linguistic programming. You could look into affirmations. So like I am. So they're I am statements. So I am powerful. I am smart. I am committed. I am going to get better each day. Things that you can actually say out loud to yourself. You start literally programming it. The more you say it, the more you program it, and you start to believe it. It takes some time, but it is really powerful stuff. You can look into things like emotional freedom technique, which is really useful. There's Dr. Demartini. You can look into the Demartini method. He's really great too. So those are all things you can look into for, again, addressing the emotional part of this. So that's a lot that we covered today. In that, it kind of went a little bit longer than I would have liked, but I hope that you kind of got something from this. So, when we're talking about energy, when we're talking about chronic fatigue, obviously there's a lot of different, parts that are playing a role. I hope this was helpful. If you're interested, I am still kind of working with people one-on-one, still taking on some new clients. So if you're interested, you could get in touch with me through my email. You could get in touch with me through the DMs. If you want to try to get back on track on your health journey in a variety of different ways, these are just some of the ways we kind of go about kind of what we're talking about and putting the pieces together to come up with a plan for you that's going to lead you to live your best health your most healthy, best life, one that you do not necessarily need to rely on a government or the pharmaceutical industry to survive. So thank you for tuning in. I will see you guys next time. Have a great day.